On the morning of August 10th, 2014, a man named Eric Wolf was violently shaken awake by his 10-year-old daughter Alexis. He had been asleep on a reclining couch in the living room of his home in Jackson County, Michigan, having just finished an overnight shift at work a while earlier. Under normal circumstances, Eric might have been upset. After all, he hadn't planned on getting up for several hours. However, when he caught a glimpse of the look on his daughter's face, he could immediately tell that something was wrong. Alexis was frantic and said that she needed him to come upstairs right away. Though still dazed from lack of sleep, Eric followed Alexis up to the master bedroom. Once inside, it would take just seconds for him to pick up the phone and dial 911. When investigators arrived at the scene, they quickly discovered why. What they found there was truly the stuff of nightmares, the kind of scene that was enough to unsettle even the most hardened of detectives. However, as authorities would soon learn, this was far from the only thing about the case that they weren't prepared for. Just as they became convinced that they were on the right track, they were thrown by an unbelievable curveball, one that would not only shock them, but which would completely change the course of their investigation. From the time that she was a child, Frances Marie Craig was the kind of person who always seemed to leave a lasting positive impression on others. Known by Franny to those close to her, growing up she was social and made friends easily wherever she went. People were drawn to her kindness, her positive outlook on life, and her sense of humor, with friends saying that she was quick with a joke and always seemed to be smiling. One in particular described it this way, quote, "She was one of those people that no matter how bad a mood you were in, she would make you feel better." After graduating from Leslie High School in 2003, Franny attended Baker College in Jackson, Michigan. Unfortunately, sources don't mention what kinds of courses she was interested in or whether she ever finished her studies, but we do know that her life took on a new focus just a few years later, when Franny and her then boyfriend brought two little girls into the world just a couple of years apart. While Franny's romantic relationship with the girls' father eventually ended, those that knew her were blown away by how well she rose to the challenges of single motherhood. She adored her daughters, and despite working 2 jobs to keep them all financially afloat, always made time to be there for them. While Franny's world was centered around her kids, she never gave up on finding love. More than anything, she dreamed of finding someone to share her life with and getting married, to the point that her friends said that she would talk constantly about throwing her fairy tale wedding, even when she wasn't actually seeing anyone. To Franny's delight, though, it seemed like her dream might finally come true in 2012, when she met and started dating 29-year-old Eric Wolf. Like Franny, Eric was also the single parent to a young daughter named Alexis. Over the next couple of years, they became a family, with Franny and Eric getting engaged and the 5 of them moving in together. Near the beginning of 2014, they took another big step, buying a house in a quiet neighborhood in Summit Township. In the months that followed, it seemed like everything was coming together for the young family. Franny was finally planning her dream wedding, peppering her friends with endless excited updates in the lead-up to the September 27th ceremony. However, little did anyone know, the wedding would never happen. As just 5 days before her 29th birthday, Franny's new home would be the scene of a horrifying tragedy. As far as Franny Craig and her family were concerned, there was nothing particularly out of the ordinary about the night of August 9th. Eric left for work shortly before the start of his 12-hour shift at 6 p.m. that evening, while Franny decided to take the 3 girls out to a local fair. Sadly, as the kids were tucked into bed that night, they had no idea that it would be the last memory that they would ever share together as a family. Sometime after 6 a.m. the following morning, Eric arrived back at their home on Timbercrest Trail. He did a quick sweep of the upstairs bedrooms, then went back down to the living room and crashed on a reclining couch. He laid back sleeping there for a few hours, until he was shaken violently awake by Alexis. Disturbingly, she said that there was something wrong with Franny. She had gone into their bedroom, only to find her lying motionless on the floor. Eric went upstairs to investigate, after which he would make a chilling 911 call.
Yeah, I got somebody up to my house right now. She has that. I think she's dead.
Okay, so has she been sick?
No, there's blood everywhere.
Do you know where it's coming from?
I don't know.
Okay, can you tell if she's breathing?
She's not. She's cold. She's dead.
When detectives arrived at the scene around 11 a.m. that morning, they found Franny lying dead on the floor next to the far side of the bed. Disturbingly, she had zip ties around each of her wrists, as if she had been strapped to the bed's frame before later being cut loose. However, the most horrifying part of the whole situation was Franny's wounds. It was estimated that she had been stabbed a staggering 90 times, with the most brutal part of the assault focused on her neck. While there was plenty of blood evidence at the scene, investigators were unable to recover the murder weapon. A garage door at the residence was found to be unlocked, though this didn't necessarily mean anything given that Eric had been the last person to arrive home that morning and could have simply forgotten to lock the door. However, there were also no signs of forced entry anywhere else. Given the chilling state of the crime scene, detectives began to speculate early on that Franny's murder had been personal in nature. Moreover, they theorized, the person responsible had likely been in the midst of a violent rage at the time, which could have explained the absolute brutality of the killing. Still, the question remained, who could have possibly had the motive to do such a thing? As it happened, it didn't take long before investigators noticed some unsettling details, ones that they thought might offer the answers they were looking for. After receiving the harrowing 911 call from Eric, detectives and forensics personnel spent more than 12 hours straight combing through the crime scene gathering evidence. Several items were swabbed and sent off to the Michigan State Police Crime Lab, with the hopes that they might reveal DNA that could prove crucial to solving the case. The heavy police presence outside the Timbercrest Trail home was hard to miss for local residents, who were understandably concerned by the jarring transformation of their normally quiet and peaceful neighborhood. One resident described it to local media this way, quote, "It's totally out of left field. The only activity we have back here is a lot of deer." Though it would take a couple of days for the first official details about the case to be reported, it was obvious to anyone paying attention that something terrible had happened, especially as Franny's heartbroken friends and family members began to congregate outside and learn that she was gone. One reaction that we came across over and over again during the research for this story was disbelief. No one could accept that something like this had happened to her, not to someone who had brought so much laughter, joy, and positivity into their lives. Obviously, we could never fully appreciate or put into words what this loss was like for those that knew Franny, but we can provide a couple of snapshots of the outpouring of grief that followed her death. From her close friend who said that her child had essentially lost a second mother, to the manager at the sports bar where she worked, who described the agony of having to tell her coworkers what had happened. Quote, "It's been a struggle to come to work every day and watch the girls who haven't heard yet come in and just bawl. It's been really hard, and there's nothing you can do or say." When Franny's funeral was held just over a week later, the full scope of just how many lives she had touched could finally be appreciated for the first time. To give you an idea, even Franny's mail carrier attended the ceremony. As stunned as everyone was by Franny's chilling murder, however, it wasn't long before disbelief started to give way to suspicion, and for many, there was one obvious person who came to mind: Franny's fiancé, Eric Wolf. Aside from processing the crime scene, the top priority for detectives when they initially began investigating Franny's murder was sitting down with Eric. Not only was he one of the people closest to her, but he had also been present at the time her body was discovered. Before questioning him, though, authorities first tried to learn as much about the 29-year-old as they could. Immediately, there were red flags. Detectives discovered that he had a history of domestic incidents with previous partners, and when they dug a little underneath the surface, they were told that the relationship between him and Franny wasn't necessarily the fairy tale that it was cracked up to be either. Friends told police that though Franny seemed happy for the most part, they weren't necessarily fans of her husband-to-be. More than one person said that they felt he was cocky, and that unlike Franny, he seemed to prioritize him and his own daughter over her 2 girls. Franny's parents, meanwhile, offered additional useful insight. They said that though the couple had been publicly projecting a lot of excitement about their upcoming wedding, privately, both Franny and Eric were having doubts. This, detectives believed, could have been a potential motive. Maybe one of them had gotten cold feet, leading to a violent confrontation. If investigators found these details suspicious, however, it was nothing compared to what they would learn when they brought Eric in for a formal interview. From the very beginning, the biggest thing that stuck out to detectives was the timeline of how Franny's body had been discovered. They knew that Eric had arrived home sometime after 6 a.m. that morning. So how had it taken several hours for him to call 911? Especially since he admitted that before falling asleep in the living room, he had gone up and briefly looked into all of the bedrooms. In the interview, Eric described it this way.
I came home this morning because I work 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. Mm-hmm. I went upstairs, I checked both the girls' room before going in our bedroom.
Did you see anything on the mattress when you first came in?
I guess I might have saw that streak. I thought maybe she had been drinking or something because she was in almost like a funny position on the floor, which she doesn't drink hardly ever. I knew better than to wake her. I know from prior experience whenever I've woken her up, she's not a morning person and I get yelled at.
To the complete surprise of detectives, Eric explained that he did actually see Franny on the floor of their room when he arrived home, but that it didn't register to him as anything serious. He wasn't clear as to whether he noticed any of the blood in the room, at points appearing to acknowledge it, but then at others referring to it as that streak, and saying that it didn't jump out like anything crazy. What troubled investigators further was the manner in which Eric spoke. He was fairly deadpan and wasn't expressing any outwardly strong emotions. Detectives pressed him further to try and ascertain whether this was simply shock or whether there might be a darker explanation. They began to lean further in this latter direction when they got to around the hour mark of the interview, and things got even stranger.
Up till just now, maybe since we've been here, I thought that if it wasn't an accident, then it was probably self-induced. And the only reason I say self-induced is just because of how high-strung everything is right before this wedding, and
It's a lot of stress.
yeah.
It was one thing for Eric to claim that he either hadn't seen or hadn't processed what had happened when he first walked into the crime scene. However, it was entirely another, detectives thought, to suggest that Franny had somehow taken her own life. The idea that the horrific wounds she had suffered were somehow self-inflicted just seemed impossible for anyone to seriously believe, let alone the fact that this explanation failed to account for the zip ties around her wrists or the lack of a murder weapon at the scene. Investigators pressed him further.
Did you
No.
know what?
No, I didn't do this. I didn't know anything about it. I walked in and I walked out, went to sleep, got up, went back in and reported it.
But that brings me back to the questions we just asked. You made it at least halfway into that
I
bed.
did make it, and I admit that now. I admit that in front of whoever needs to hear it. But I want to make that perfectly clear that my stance on this is exactly what I said. I went in for whatever reason it was. I didn't react.
Though Eric categorically denied any involvement and stuck to his story completely, by the time the interview had finished, he had become the prime suspect in the case. As a precaution, his daughter was temporarily removed from his custody and placed in the care of family members, just like Franny's 2 girls had been. Despite their mounting suspicions, however, investigators knew that so far they had no real evidence against Eric. They still hoped that DNA would be found amongst the samples that they had sent away to the state crime lab, but in the meantime, they decided to follow up on another avenue of inquiry: Eric's alibi. When police obtained security footage from all of the cameras at Eric's workplace, they were initially optimistic that they would be able to use this to poke holes in his whereabouts on the night of the murder. However, they quickly discovered that there was a major problem. While the company did have cameras covering the main entrance to the building, not all of the conceivable entries and exits were covered. What footage they were able to obtain showed that Eric had indeed showed up and left for work when he had originally stated, something that was further verified by his employee time card. In the minds of detectives, this left them more or less in limbo. On the one hand, the existing video footage could be seen as evidence that Eric was telling them the truth. On the other, the lack of complete camera coverage meant that if he was familiar enough with his company's surveillance system, he could have potentially used these security weaknesses to his advantage, giving him more than enough time to commit the crime, return to work, and leave later as if nothing had happened. Once again, there were suspicions, but no evidence. Authorities would continue to look into Eric, but now they decided it was time to consider other possibilities as well. When detectives began looking into alternative suspects in Franny's murder, the next obvious area of interest was former partners. This included the father of her 2 girls, as well as another ex-boyfriend. Police were initially interested after finding out that this second ex no longer lived in the area, but had recently returned, though when police spoke to him, they found him completely open, honest, and willing to talk. He also had a solid alibi. Nothing incriminating was likewise uncovered about any of Franny's other partners. Authorities next looked into Franny's 2 jobs. The first, the job at the sports bar, turned up nothing of significant interest. However, the same couldn't be said of her second job. It turned out that a little over a year prior to her death, Franny had been working at a retail store when she witnessed 2 young people shoplifting during her shift. She was in the middle of confronting the pair when out of nowhere she was attacked by the suspect's mother. The assault had left her with an eye injury as well as lasting emotional damage, and the woman behind the attack had actually been charged and convicted of unarmed robbery. Upon learning this, detectives speculated that perhaps the woman had held a grudge over the incident and that maybe this had driven her to murder. However, it turned out to be another dead end. When police questioned her, she also had a solid alibi. Detectives were even more frustrated when they obtained a warrant for Franny and Eric's electronic devices, hoping to uncover any potential motives or conflicts in their lives that they might have overlooked. They were especially optimistic after recovering Franny's cell phone, which had been missing from her home but had been found during a ground search in the vicinity of the Timbercrest Trail residence. The device had been smashed up against a tree, and as a result, detectives theorized that this might have been deliberately done by the perpetrator to try and stop them from seeing what was on it. However, when they combed through both Eric and Franny's cell phone records, they were at a loss. There were no unusual activities or communications on either of their phones. With no alternative explanations panning out, detectives returned to the one theory they had that they felt made sense. They continued to ask about Eric Wolf. Hoping to get a better sense of Eric and Franny's home life, they spoke to a friend of theirs named Ryan Marshall. Ryan had actually lived with the family for a couple of months before they moved to their new home in Summit Township, and investigators thought that he might be able to offer a more intimate picture of their relationship. However, Ryan went the complete opposite direction the detectives were expecting. He said that as far as he was aware, everything was great between Eric and Franny. They had taken him in at a rough time in his life when his house had burned down in March of that year. More than anything, though, he stressed that Eric was a good guy and that he definitely wouldn't do anything to hurt his fiancée. Following the interview with Ryan Marshall, investigators were truly baffled. Eric had certainly looked suspicious and was the only person who seemed to have any credible motive in the case, but they recognized that even this theory wasn't fully panning out. Luckily, it was at this point the detectives finally got their most concrete lead in the case yet. Just like everything else up until now, though, it wasn't what they had expected. Roughly 3 months after Franny Craig's murder, detectives received a huge break in their investigation. It was from the Michigan State Crime Lab, who notified them that there had been a DNA match to a sample that had been taken from the zip ties around Franny's wrists. When the profile had been run through state and federal DNA databases, it had produced a hit. The only thing was, though, the match wasn't to Eric Wolf, or anyone else police had looked at so far. It was to a man that they had never heard of before, named Cortez Butler. When investigators looked into Butler's background, they discovered that he was a 42-year-old convicted felon who had previously served more than 20 years for murder. This was somewhat encouraging news. After all, Butler was obviously capable of committing a crime this heinous. However, as far as detectives could tell, there was zero connection between him and anyone else involved in Franny's case. Also, Butler was from Detroit. It wasn't clear what, if any, connections he had to Jackson County. Still, with a DNA match now in hand, authorities knew that they had to speak with him. By the time detectives were able to locate Butler, it was December of 2014, and he was now back in police custody in connection with yet another unrelated murder. This time, it was for the killing of a 79-year-old man following a dispute over pills and money a few days earlier. When investigators sat down with Butler, he was in a less than receptive mood. He refused to talk without a deal and said that either way it wouldn't do him any good because he was likely, quote, cooked for this new murder. Determined to get something out of Butler, though, detectives continued to press him hard. Finally, he agreed, but only under one condition. They couldn't tape the interview. This was a big risk for authorities because it meant that anything they got from Butler from here on out might be inadmissible in court. Realizing that they were stuck, though, they agreed. That's when things took an unbelievable turn, as Butler revealed that police had been wrong about their entire investigation from the start. Now eager to speak once they were off the record, Butler began to answer detectives' questions. However, they didn't get very far in before he stopped them. To their surprise, he said that they had no idea what they were talking about. Still convinced that Eric Wolf had to be related to the case somehow, investigators had started their questioning by assuming Butler had been hired as a hitman to carry out Franny's murder. Butler said that, yes, he had been hired to commit a murder, but not by Eric Wolf. Not only that, but Franny Craig wasn't even the intended target. In fact, he had no idea who the couple even were. Butler explained that he had been hired by a 48-year-old man named Clifford McKee. Clifford had also previously served more than 2 decades for murder and met Butler while the two of them were doing time together at the same facility. A few months earlier, Clifford had reached out to Butler, saying that he needed something taken care of for his 26-year-old nephew, Rodney McKee. Rodney McKee was a big-time drug dealer in Jackson County and had wanted Butler to retaliate against a witness in an upcoming arson case. That witness was none other than Franny and Eric's friend, Ryan Marshall. It turned out that Ryan's mother, Donna, had been one of Rodney McKee's dealers, but had wanted to stop selling for him. When she refused to reconsider, Rodney had tried to burn her house down with her and Ryan in it. While the Marshall's house had been successfully destroyed, neither of them had been killed as intended. Worse for Rodney McKee, Ryan had witnessed what had happened and had started speaking to police. As a result, Rodney was arrested and charged. As further retaliation, he had hired Butler through his uncle to try and murder Ryan. Butler told detectives that the whole August 10th murder had played out due to flawed information. He knew that Ryan Marshall had been living with Eric and Franny, but didn't realize that he hadn't come with them when they moved to their new home in Summit Township. He had broken in expecting to find Ryan, and when he didn't, went into Franny's room demanding answers. Though Butler initially gave the excuse that he thought Franny had looked at his face and that's why he had killed her, he later chillingly contradicted himself. He said that he had already decided when he broke into the house that night that no matter what happened, he was going to commit a murder. In addition to all of these disturbing details, Butler offered information that had never been released to the public, such as how he had disposed of Franny's cell phone, how he had gotten into her and Eric's house through the unlocked garage door, and how he had used the zip ties to restrain Franny during the attack. At the end of Butler's confession, detectives couldn't believe how wrong they had been. As one of them later put it in an interview, "It was a good thing we were already sitting down." After obtaining cell phone records for Cortez Butler and Rodney and Clifford McKee, authorities were able to confirm the twisted details of their plot. GPS data placed Butler in Jackson County in the lead up to and on the night of the murder, and this was the only time his phone was recorded leaving the greater Detroit area. Text messages also revealed how they had arranged a price of $10,000 for the hit on Ryan Marshall, half of which was paid up front. Chillingly, the plan to murder Ryan had continued even after the first botched attempt, though Butler had eventually given up, telling Clifford McKee that there were, quote, too many red flags. More than a year after Franny Craig's death in October of 2015, Cortez Butler, Clifford McKee, and Rodney McKee were each charged with open murder, conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, and first-degree home invasion. The McKees were also further charged with soliciting murder. They were tried jointly, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison in May of 2016. At the sentencing hearing, Franny's mother made a powerful statement in which she spoke about the hole that had forever been left in the hearts and lives of Franny's friends and family. In it, she referred to Butler and the two McKees as an unholy trinity and condemned them for the way that they had so cruelly snuffed out Franny's life and had simply left her for her children to find her. The statement is truly gut-wrenching to watch, but we left a link in the description below for those interested, as we feel it drives home the loss that Franny's family experienced better than we ever could. As a bit more background info, it turns out that the issue detectives were worried about with Butler's untaped confession did sort of come back to haunt them. While detectives were allowed to testify as to the contents of the confession during the trial, this was one of the grounds that the men later used to try and appeal their convictions. Though an appeals court found that Butler would have been convicted with or without the confession due to the DNA evidence, the situation apparently wasn't as clear with the McKees. In 2020, they were granted an order for oral arguments to be heard before the Michigan Supreme Court. In April of 2022, those arguments were heard, though, and were denied because the justices were not persuaded that the issues brought forth were ones that needed to be reviewed by the court. At the present time, it appears that this is where the case currently stands, though it remains to be seen if the three men will continue to try and appeal their sentences. All of them are currently in prison. As for our own final thoughts on the case, it's difficult to know what to say about a story this senselessly tragic. However, we're reminded of something that we touched on a few weeks back, namely, with people's reactions to traumatic situations. Eric Wolf is probably the best example we've come across yet in the stories we've covered of why it's important to challenge our preconceived notions of what a, quote, normal reaction to trauma looks like. While we can't say that we fully understand what happened here, it's very easy to see how had this gone a different way, an innocent man might have ended up in prison. It's a scary thought, and all we can say is that we're glad in this case it didn't result in a second tragedy taking place. Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a minute to thank our amazing supporters over on Patreon. As many of you are aware, our situation on YouTube always seems to be a bit uncertain, but our patrons help to ensure that we can continue to make content like this long term without having to worry as much about what surprises might be thrown our way. Plus, patrons also get access to 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. If you'd like to help support the channel directly, head over to patreon.com/crimezone to join. You can also find that link in the description below. As always, thank you so much for watching, and take care.